Hi, today we're going to talk about sticklebacks and the key takeaways from the activity that you did involving sticklebacks. Sticklebacks are a commonly used species when studying evolution because they've been studied fairly extensively. However, before we talk about that, I want to remind you of some of the key terms that you need to incorporate when you talk about evolution, some of the important vocabulary. So remember, evolution is a change in the allele frequency of a population over time. When we talk about evolution, we frequently talk about fitness, the number of offsprings an individual has relative to other individuals. So you can have greater or lesser or equal fitness to another individual. A selective pressure is anything that might impact an individual's fitness, usually negatively, but technically in any direction. A selective advantage is any situation where an individual's fitness is increased. Maybe it has a trait that gives it some kind of an advantage. And then finally, adaptations. These are traits or characteristics that help to increase an individual's fitness. So as you talk about evolution leading up to our test on Friday, make sure to use these terms and incorporate them into your descriptions. So sticklebacks. There's two different types of sticklebacks. There is a saltwater variety, which has a large pelvic spine sticking out. And there's a freshwater variety that does not have a spine sticking out. It's got a tiny spine that is internal and doesn't actually stand out. Okay, these are our two types. And so one of the questions that you were looking at is, why are there two different types? How did that come about? What factors influenced it and such? So let's go ahead and discuss that. Environment impacts fitness. We've seen this multiple times throughout this unit. And sticklebacks are found in saltwater and freshwater. They're unusual among fish in that they can go back and forth. Generally, adult sticklebacks live in the ocean. However, when it comes time to spawn, for them to breed, they swim into freshwater streams and lakes, and they will spawn there. Well, in the different environments, we have very different circumstances, different environmental conditions, and different selective pressures. So in saltwater, there are often large predators that can eat a stickleback very easily, and there are limited places to hide. And in response to that, over an extended period of time, sticklebacks have evolved armor and pelvic spines as a way to defend themselves in a dangerous environment. So these armor and spines provide a selective advantage. Freshwater is a very different situation. There are few large predators, and there are many places to hide. So armor and spines aren't as beneficial as you would expect in saltwater. However, there's a different predator. The primary predator in freshwater is dragonfly larvae. Dragonfly larvae are able to grab the spines of a stickleback to catch it. So in this case, no spines provides a selective advantage over having spines. And so when we look at sticklebacks, the spined variety tends to occur in saltwater. The freshwater variety tends to have no spines. So it's influenced by the environment they live in. One of the things that you saw in the activity was this chart. This was in the video, and I want to talk about this to make sure we understand what was happening here. So this chart is demonstrating the abundance of no spines, the green line, and red spines over a period of time in a fossil deposit that represents a lake that occurred during the glacier melt. So if you look at this, what happens with the no spine, the freshwater variety, is they're very frequent. And then, after a period of time, they crash. There's very few of them. But then they rebuild the population and become frequent again. In contrast, sticklebacks with spines are very rare, and then there's a large spike of them. But then they taper off again and become very rare again. So this illustrates a couple things, and understanding this chart is important. First off, changes in allele frequency can happen rather quickly. We don't have a time scale on here, but this was not thousands of years. This happened in a fairly short period of time, a few years at most. So evolution can occur quickly. It doesn't have to take an extended period of time. Okay. Also, as environments change, selective advantage and fitness can also change. What they believe happened in this case is there was a freshwater lake that contained many freshwater sticklebacks that did not have spines that was suddenly opened up to the ocean. When that happened, saltwater sticklebacks from the ocean were able to come into the lake, and so their numbers increased. and they became more abundant than the no-spined variety. However, that lake then closed off from the ocean. And at that point, the same selective pressures that had pushed for no spines took over, and we see drop of those with spines. They were being eaten by dragonfly larvae, not able to survive. The green ones with no spines had the selective advantage, and so their fitness was higher and they were able to reproduce more, increasing over time. So it's really important to remember and understand that who has the selective advantage and whose fitness level is the highest can radically change as environmental factors shift. So how did the sticklebacks actually lose their spines? The original type had spines. The derivative version, the freshwater version, doesn't have spines, so they lost them. Well, losing pelvic spines is the equivalent of humans losing their hind legs. This is a major evolutionary event. But what's a little strange is we don't see intermediary fossils. We don't see some sticklebacks with medium-length spines, and over time them getting smaller and smaller, which you kind of would expect as mutations accumulate over time, affecting the spines. So how did this happen? Well, in the video they talked about the genes actually that affect all parts that grow for the spine are not changed. There's no mutations in the protein coding regions of those different genes. They're fine. Instead, where they found the mutation was in the regulatory genes. These are genes that turn on numerous other genes. They create a protein that will activate other genes, probably acting as transcription factors. The genes themselves are not modified. The regulatory genes, in this case up here represented by B and C, two different regulatory genes, these get modified, so our protein, our transcription factor, is not going to be produced. When that's not produced, the pelvic spines will not form at all. Okay? This is kind of like if you have an orchestra. If you take an orchestra and you remove a couple instruments from it, you still have an orchestra. The sound is going to be different. It might not sound as good, or it definitely will sound different, but you still have an orchestra. On the other hand, if you remove the conductor, the one who controls everything and guides it, you no longer have an orchestra. You just have a bunch of instruments playing randomly. So it is fairly common. Some of these big evolutionary changes, it's not actually a large number of mutations that are causing it. Instead, the regulatory gene that activates many of those other characteristics, other proteins, is mutated. So the mutation occurred inside this gene that controlled the development in the pelvis. The other great thing about this kind of mutation is other control genes can occur in different cells. For example, here, there's a control gene for this protein when it occurs in the jaw. That part's still working. So this gene is working, functioning fine in the jaw area, but in the pelvis it's not. So part of the body is affected, other parts are not. And this has become a major regulatory mechanism used in the evolution of different species. So the final takeaway when talking about sticklebacks and understanding them is sticklebacks have survived and continued to thrive because of genetic variation. They had a variety of genes, different mutations and stuff, and that has enabled them to survive in saltwater environments and a variety of freshwater environments. It actually enabled them to survive during the melting of the great glaciers in North America and now thrive in many lakes around the continent. Genetic variation is very, very important for species survival in the long term because it allows species to survive large-scale environmental fluctuations and changes. The more genetically diverse a species is, the more likely it will have characteristics that help some of its members have a selective advantage and survive, while others of its members might die off because of decreased fitness. So long-term survival is tied in very much with genetic variation. So those are our key takeaways for sticklebacks. If you have any questions, go ahead and let me know.